The night was heavy with silence, the kind that made every creak and whisper feel amplified. As the protagonist approached Sarah's house, the chill of the air seemed to seep into their bones. Sarah had called only minutes ago, her voice strained and distant, asking them to come over. She hadn't explained why, and the vagueness gnawed at their curiosity. They pushed open the gate, its rusty hinges groaning in protest. The house loomed ahead, its edges blurred by darkness. Something about the place felt off, like the shadows themselves were holding their breath. When they reached the front door, they found it unlocked. Strange. Sarah was always cautious, double-checking locks even during the day. The protagonist hesitated, hand hovering above the doorknob before finally pushing the door open. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Sarah," they called, their voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. The familiar hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the soft glow of a nightlight plugged into the far wall. As they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, the sound oddly sharp against the silence. Moving forward, they couldn't shake the creeping sensation of being watched. Every shadow felt too thick, too deliberate, as if hiding something just beyond their sight. They swallowed hard, forcing their feet to keep moving toward Sarah's room. A faint light spilled from beneath the door, a warm glow that should have felt comforting but instead twisted their stomach with unease. They reached for the doorknob, their fingers trembling. The door creaked open, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the bedside lamp. Sarah lay sprawled on her bed, blankets tangled around her legs. But she wasn't alone. A man lay beside her, his arm draped across her shoulder, their bodies curled together in peaceful intimacy. His face was turned away, but the broadness of his shoulders and the unruly dark hair were familiar. Ethan, Sarah's boyfriend. The protagonist's cheeks burned with embarrassment. They hadn't expected to barge in on such a private moment. Guilt prickled their skin, but something urged them to stay, some unnamed instinct refusing to let them turn away just yet. The air felt strange, heavy and cold, as if the room itself rejected their presence. They took a step backward, intent on leaving quietly, but their gaze locked onto Ethan's face. It was pale, too pale, the kind of pallor that spoke of something unnatural. His eyes were slightly open, not enough to suggest consciousness, but enough to send a spike of dread straight through the protagonist's chest. Their pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Panic clawed at the protagonist's chest, their breath hitching as they stared at Ethan's half-open eyes. They appeared vacant, glassy, reflecting nothing but the dim light pooling from the bedside lamp. A chill seeped into the air, sharp and unnatural. The protagonist wanted to leave, to turn and walk away from whatever twisted scene they'd stumbled upon. But their feet remained rooted to the floor, as if the truth held them captive. "Sarah," they called, their voice low, trembling. Sarah stirred, her eyelids fluttering before slowly peeling open. Disorientation clouded her expression, a groggy haze that gradually gave way to awareness. She blinked up at the protagonist, her confusion deepening. What are you doing here?" she mumbled, voice thick with sleep. The protagonist's gaze darted between Sarah and the man lying beside her. They tried to steady their voice, but the words tumbled out, raw and frantic. "Sarah, something's wrong with Ethan." For a moment, Sarah stared at them as if the words were foreign. Then, following their gaze, she looked at Ethan. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating with shock. She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against his cheek. "Ethan!" Her voice cracked, terror creeping into every syllable. "Wake up. Ethan, please." Her fingers pressed against his skin, only to recoil instantly. The look of horror etched onto her face was answer enough. Ethan's skin was icy, a lifeless chill that no living person could possess. "Sarah, what's going on?" The protagonist's voice wavered, their own fear clawing at their sanity. He wasn't supposed to be here," Sarah whispered, eyes darting around the room as if searching for answers. "He said he was going out of town. He texted me last night, told me he'd be gone for a week." The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The protagonist's mind scrambled to make sense of the impossible. Ethan shouldn't be here. And yet, he was, his body cold and unresponsive, as if something had drained the life from him. But he's here," the protagonist stammered. "You were just sleeping next to him." Sarah's face paled, her breathing quickening as reality set in. I thought he surprised me. He must have come back early and," her voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. No, this doesn't make any sense." The protagonist took a shaky step backward, their fingers clutching the edge of the doorframe. Something terrible had happened here, something far beyond their understanding. And the realization that Ethan's presence defied explanation was like ice water flooding their veins. "We need to leave," the protagonist said, their voice low but urgent. "Now." Sarah nodded, her fear mirroring their own. But just as they turned to flee, a sound echoed through the darkness, soft, shuffling footsteps. Someone, or something, was still in the house. Their breath tangled in their throats as the sound of footsteps drew nearer. Slow. Heavy. Each step a dreadful reminder that they weren't alone. The protagonist's eyes locked onto Sarah's, both of them paralyzed by the same icy terror. Whatever rationality they clung to was slipping away, drowned by the oppressive darkness pressing in around them. Is someone else here?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know. But we need to get out of here," the protagonist replied, their words a desperate rush. But even as they spoke, something inside the room pulled at them, a mystery demanding to be solved. The kind of curiosity that flirts with madness. And yet, they couldn't look away from Ethan's lifeless body, couldn't erase the image of his vacant eyes. They took a step forward, adrenaline battling with the instinct to flee. Their fingers trembled as they reached toward Ethan, needing to confirm what their mind already screamed. They touched his arm. It was stiff, unyielding. As if death had claimed him long before they arrived. "Sarah, we have to leave," the protagonist urged, but Sarah's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, her breaths coming in shallow, uneven bursts. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. "He wasn't supposed to be here. He told me he was leaving town. I even texted him earlier today, and he replied. He said he'd call me tomorrow." The protagonist's skin prickled. How could Ethan have responded if he was here, cold and motionless, for who knows how long? The possibility twisted their gut. "Maybe he never left," the protagonist said, though the words felt wrong the moment they left their mouth. "Or maybe someone's messing with us." "Messing with us? How?" Sarah snapped, her desperation morphing into anger. But even her fury trembled under the weight of fear. "I don't know," the protagonist snapped back. "But they gestured at Ethan's body. "This is impossible." They stared at each other, suspended between terror and confusion. Then, something changed. The sound of footsteps had stopped. The silence returned, deeper and more consuming than before. Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice fragile as glass. The protagonist nodded. "Yeah. And I think it knows we're here." Sarah's expression crumpled, tears threatening to spill over. "We need to go. Now." The protagonist didn't argue. They spun toward the door, Sarah stumbling after them. But the quiet was worse than the sound. It felt calculated, deliberate. As if whatever was there was simply waiting. And as they stepped into the hallway, the darkness seemed to grow thicker. Sentient. Watching, the hallway stretched before them, its shadows thick and impenetrable. The air clung to their skin like frost, each breath a struggle against the icy grip of terror. The protagonist's hand closed around Sarah's wrist, their urgency igniting her into motion. "Come on. We need to get out of here," the protagonist hissed, their voice shredded by panic. Sarah's eyes darted around wildly, her entire body trembling as if she'd been plunged into freezing water. Together, they stumbled down the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the silence. But it was the absence of sound that made everything worse. No more shuffling footsteps. No more creaks or groans. Just the deafening, dreadful stillness. They reached the stairs, their frantic movements clumsy and desperate. Sarah's foot slipped on the second step, her hand clutching the railing with a white-knuckled grip. But she pushed herself forward, refusing to look back. The protagonist's heartbeat pounded in their ears, a frenzied rhythm urging them to move faster, to escape before whatever haunted that house decided to catch them. They reached the front door and threw it open, the cool night air rushing in like salvation. They stumbled outside, their lungs heaving as if they'd been drowning. The darkness of the street felt safer than the darkness inside. But they didn't stop running. Not until they reached the protagonist's car parked haphazardly at the curb. Fumbling with trembling hands, the protagonist yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat. Sarah collapsed into the passenger seat, her breathing shallow and broken. Without a word, the protagonist twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a blessed sound cutting through the silence. They sped down the deserted street, leaving Sarah's house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them dared to. Words felt meaningless against the impossible reality they had just faced. But even as the distance between them and the house grew, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. That whatever presence lingered in that room had latched onto them, a shadow creeping ever closer. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice hollow and raw. "Ethan can't be. He can't be gone. I talked to him today. I swear I did." The protagonist's hands tightened around the steering wheel, their knuckles aching from the pressure. "I don't know what's going on, Sarah. But that thing back there, it wasn't him." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, her gaze distant, unfocused. "Then what was it? And how did it get into my house?" The protagonist had no answers. Only a gnawing dread that nothing about their lives would ever be the same. Because deep down, they both knew the truth. Whatever was in that room was still there, waiting. And they had no idea if it would stay confined to the shadows they left behind.